you, and thanks for the opportunity of being back here. When I was here last time, I spoke about networks. I spoke about how the internet structure looks like and how we communicate to these complicated networks. I spoke about the way our molecules are connected to each other through our cells and what that means actually for diseases and for our ability to cure diseases. And I also spoke about how important roles networks play within the organizations, how each company like Generali has a very important network inside it that tells us how people communicate each other, distinct from the organizational structure, yet defining for the success of the organization. Today, I would like to speak about another line of research that we've been doing in the last 5 years, which asked a question not unrelated to networks. You know, it's one thing to understand how a network looks like and what is its large-scale structure. But ultimately, we as an individuals, we're just one node in this network. And what we really deeply care about is that what does this network do for us? How is it determining our success? And how can we be successful or not successful given the embedding in the network that we're part of? So about 5 or 6 years ago, we took this challenge on and we started to ask, what is it really that determines the success of a node? Be that an individual, be that a company, be that an artist, be that a businessman, or be that a scientist. And so what I'm going to speak about in the next 15 minutes is really a little snippet from that investigation, because there's so many aspects of that. And actually, today we'll not be talking much about networks. I'm sure you remember last time what I said everything, but why not take a quiz? but we'll be talking about how do we understand success. Now, one of the things we learn in school that if you want to have success or recognition, you must first have performance, right? And that, of course, is certainly true in sports, where performance uniquely determines success. The faster that you run, the better runner you are, right? And the more goals you kick in soccer, the better soccer player or forward you are, and so on. But what I would like to actually point out to you, that from a big data perspective, performance and success are very, very different animals. Because performance is about an individual and about what an individual does. So your performance is about you. However, your success is not about you, but it's about us. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that your performance is really something uniquely assigned to you of how well you do certain things, but success really corresponds to a collective judgment of your performance. How well we perceive your performance, how well we reward you for that. Now, sports is a unique situation where performance is uniquely measured, right? And that uniquely gives rise to success. But in most areas of creative or non-creative human performance, we're not able to measure as precisely your performance as you do in sports. Yet, we perceive that performance creates success. So what's the relationship between the two? Now, let's go back. So when we started looking deeply into this story, we realized that not only performance is a unique individual property and success is a collective property, but it means different measurability. Because for measuring performance, I have to look at you. To measure your success, I have to look at your environment. And that's many more data points, right? Much more measurable. So, but we also notice that there's a fundamental mathematical difference between performance and success. So to illustrate that, let's talk about one area where we can indeed measure performance very well, which is running, right? And what you see here is the fastest man on earth winning a competition in the Rio Olympics. And that, of course, he's the fastest man on earth because he beats the number 2. But when we look at how fast he runs, what you realize that he's less than 1% faster than the second fastest person on the competition. So the winner is less than 1% faster than the loser. And not only of that, but he doesn't run twice as fast as I do, and I'm not a good runner at all. And what this indicates is that every time we are able to measure performance, what we realize is that performance is bounded. There are no orders of magnitude difference between the performance of the two individuals, but the differences are relatively narrow. And particularly narrow are at the top. When you look at the top performing individual in any single area, when we're truly able to measure performance, there are no orders of magnitude differences between those individuals. There are perhaps 1% or 0.5% difference. So that's what we say performance is bounded. For those of you immersed in big data, the performance always follows an exponential or a fastly decaying distribution. Well, how about success? Bounded this performance, what happens to success? Well, let me give an example that kind of opened a little bit my eye in this story. When my previous book, Burst, appeared, I was in New York, and I was talking with my editor, this was actually a few months before appearance, and what do you talk with your editor? You said, who is on the bestseller list right now? And we pulled it out, and turned out that the #1 in the bestseller list was Dan Brown's new book, The Lost Symbol, and #2 was Nicholas Sparks' The Last Song. Now, when you look at the bestseller list like that, you would say, well, if Nicholas Sparks' team worked a little bit harder, maybe he could beat actually Dan Brown, right? At the end, the difference is so small that a little bit more activity, more advertisement could actually make him #1. So we said, let's look at the numbers behind this ranking. And sure enough, Nicholas Sparks has done fantastically. So in that week, actually, in that October, he sold more than 100,000 copies. That's a huge number. 1 week sales, more than 100,000. Typically, with about 3,000 to 4,000, you would make it into New York Times bestseller list. And with 10,000, you are actually guaranteed to be on the top of the bestseller list. He sold more than 100,000, and he wasn't #1. So we said, what did Dan Brown do? And here's what we saw. Dan Brown that week sold 1.2 million copies, which is telling you something very, very important. While performance is bounded, success is unbounded. That is, there are no intrinsic limits of how much success we can offer you, right? And there's no intrinsic limits because success comes from all of us toward you, right? So it's not that you have to run 100 times faster to get 100 times more success. A percentage faster is enough to get all the credit for it, right? So this is something, I like this example because it really brings in perspective how different these things are and how disconnected occasionally performance from success is, and from a data perspective, how different they are. Now, why is there a disconnect, and why do we have unbounded success while with a bounded performance? That's a much longer lecture, actually. Maybe one day we will get to that. But before we get to that, let's talk about some other thing. When does success come to an individual? At what stage of your career would you expect to do that big thing, whatever that big thing is in your life? And that's a very personal question that even myself I was very curious about. What you see here really is my scientific career. What it means is that each dot corresponds to a paper, a research paper that I published, and timelined horizontally, right, when I published that. And vertically says, is a success measure. It's how the community reacted it by citing it. How many people cited that paper within a 10-year period? And there are different colors, partly because for the red dots, we know exactly the number. For the blue, gray dots, we could only aim for the numbers. And for the circles, empty circles, we don't know the number because we haven't had 10 years to collect the data. But the bottom line, when you look at my career, you can actually distinguish 3 very different stages. Well, there's a first 10 years or so of my career where I worked a lot. You see how many red dots I published, but didn't get any recognition for it. This is actually that stage of my career, right? And then something happened in about 10 years into my career, and the paper started to actually be recognized. That's where I switched to start working on networks and so on, and it was one success after the other. That was really great. That felt like that, right? And then the question what my dean and my president and even myself want to know, where am I now, right? Do I have a chance? Will these papers actually gain impact just like the earlier ones? Or maybe I'm in that stage of my career. And it turns out that there's lots of data to suggest that I should be there. And the reason why we think that we should be there is because people have studied high-performing individuals in sciences and then concluded that many of the big discoveries that are made in science are made relatively early in their career. And this has even prompted people like Einstein to say a person who has not made his great contribution to science before the age of 30, he will never do so. And why did he do so? Why did he say that? Is because when he looked around at his peers, to Heisenberg, to Dirac, to Pauli, to Fermi and Wigner's, all the people who worked together with him, they were making their discoveries in their 20s, right? So when people actually analyze the data of when geniuses make major discoveries, it turns out that it's relatively early in our career, like in the scientific career. And so the question was, in this context, is that, do I still have a chance? Or should I actually retire and start doing something completely end because I missed that window where I could do the big discovery? So we said, okay, well, let's not only look at geniuses, but let's look at ordinary careers like myself. In my case, it was the 13th year into my career where I had my highest impact papers so far. It was the 63rd paper of my publishing career. And the question is, how would this look not only for me, but for all the other scientists out there? So we collected data for going back 100 years and reconstructed the career of many, many individuals, a project led by a wonderful Italian scientist in my lab, Roberta Sinatra. And what we ended up effectively doing is that we reconstructed the career. Each of them is a career of a scientist, and the red line actually shows when did that scientist publish his or her highest impact work. And these are the red dots. In each career, there's only one red dot, right? And when you look at the data, you see that the red dots tend to be early, actually. If you look at the number of years into how many years, it's like, you know, some people publish like 3 or 4 years into their career, their most impactful paper. Others actually publish it in year 1 of their career. So certainly it turns out that this conclusion that sociologists had drawn for geniuses seems to be burning out for ordinary scientists as well. We tend to publish our most impactful paper early in their career. But then we said, what happens if we don't look in terms of age, but we look in terms of the project? Whether is it your first or your second or the third or your last project, the one that had the biggest impact? Which means that we scratched all the careers to be from 1 to n to the last paper, and we said, in the space of the project, is it the early or the later projects that are the most successful? And so this is what you see over here. All careers are put 1 to n, and there is no early pattern anymore. That is, what we see is that in the space of the projects could be your first, middle, or your last project could be the most successful one. So why is that? How do we combine the early finding that mostly young people make big discoveries with this finding that when I look at the number of papers you publish throughout your careers, it's totally random and unpredictable will be your first, middle, or last paper? Well, the key is that innovation has no age, only productivity does. What happens is that we tend to publish most of our work early in the career and we slow down as we age. But each paper is like a lottery ticket in our career, has the same chance of winning the lottery. But if you buy most of your lottery tickets early in your career, you're much more likely to win early than later on when we find very few. So what we find is that truly, success can come at any time. That is, there is no age to creativity, there is age to productivity. But those scientists or those creators who do not slow down but continue trying over and over and over again, success can come at any time of their career. Let me show a practical example. Frank Wilczek, physicist who got the 2004 Nobel Prize for his very, very, very first paper he wrote ever in his career as a graduate student in 1973. And my favorite is John Fenn, who chemistry Nobel Prize in 2002, who he got for a work that he wrote and he discovered a discovery that he did after he was forcefully retired by Yale. and they shut his lab down because he reached the age 65, and they thought that he's too aged to actually many of the discoveries, too old. And then he moved to another university, the Virginia Commonwealth University, and it was there when he published the work for which 15 years later he actually got the Nobel Prize. So if you want to take one thing away home, is that really creativity has no age. Our willingness to keep trying, that is really aging. And as long as we stick to it, that could come the big discovery could come at any time. Now, we are in Italy, and we're talking about success, so let's take an example that is very local, and what could be more local right now than soccer? And I know that's a painful spot in Italy right now, but you also can be proud of your clubs, right, who's still doing very, very well. And so let's talk about success in soccer and the perception of performance in soccer. So probably many of you know exactly what it is much better than I do. These are the grades that experts paid by magazines provide to every single soccer player after every single pay in the leading leagues in Italy. And the grades go from low numbers like 4 and 5 to all the way to 10. 10 is rarely given. That has to be like an epoch-changing performance by a player or so on. And as you know, after every single professional game, there is actually a grade given to each player by the experts, by several magazines, telling the general public how well that particular player did in that particular game. What do the journalists do? They assess performance, right? They are experts who are assessing performance. But the question is, how well do they assess performance? Well, what is really performance when it comes to a soccer player? Well, we happen to know that, and we actually being Paolo Cintia, Luca Papalardo, Dino Petrescu, who will speak next and will say a few words about that, and Fosca Gionatti. And we had a collaboration in which we got access to the inside data of what really happens on the field in every single game. This is data that is collected by people who are tagging every single move based on the video of the play of every single player. And eventually they tell us whether that player participated in a particular faults, intercepts, crosses, takeovers, tackles, everything. So anything, every time the player touches the ball or fails to touch the ball and does the wrong thing, actually is being recorded as a performance measure. At the end, we have data for about 7,000 games for 1,100 professional players that distinguish 150 technical features and 14 million individual events. You see how detailed it is. This is the ultimate data about performance. We know everything what the players have done. We also have contextual information, like who's the player, what was the outcome of the game, what's the age of the player, the country of origin, what club it belongs to, and things like that. That apparently has nothing to do with what the player does on the field, but it will be important. So now the question we asked, could we use this data and predict how well the player has done? And we gauge ourselves by trying to predict just as well as the journalists did offering the gate. That is, could we create a robot journalist or robot expert that would give just as well grades as the journalist does? And the problem was that when we actually used the data, we could not recover what the journalists were doing. The journalists were agreeing among each other, but the robot didn't agree with what the journalists were giving. So then we realized that in order to succeed, unfortunately, we had to dumb down our journalist. That is, we had to take data away from it and say, you're not seeing that, you're not noticing it, acknowledging the fact that the experts paid by the journalists are not able to see truly the performance of the player on the field. The robot sees much more. So when we took about 2/3 of the brain away of the computer, then it started to actually agree with the journalist or with the journal ranking. But there was one more thing missing. In order to really get the real performance, it turns out that we could not use only performance data of what the player has done. We had to also include contextual data. What was the outcome of the win? Did they win or not? Age of the player, country of origin, club. And when we put all this contextual data into the mix, suddenly we were giving grades exactly as the journals did, indistinguishable from them. So the bottom line, what we learned, is that in order to reproduce what the experts do, we need to dumb down the information that we have, and we need to use contextual information that has nothing to do with the performance of the player, but what people perceive that might have happened based on the outcome of the game. But we could do much more, and that was the really exciting part. We could actually go ahead and figure out what did the experts see, what piece of the data was visible to them. And so here we are at the summary, actually. So when it comes to forwards, there are all of these different variables that they could see. And over here those are performance variables that actually the player has done. And these are the contextual variables that has nothing to do with what the players have done. It has to do with who he is and what happened at the game overall, even when he was not participating. And what we saw is that when it comes to forward, in order to reproduce the experts, we had to focus on only 4 variables, whether there were goals or not. Makes sense, right? If they kicked the goal, that's good. And whether they got a yellow card, particularly a second yellow card, right? Because that's really bad. But that was not enough. We also had to look at the goal difference and the expectation of what was the expectation for the game's outcome. And if we had these 4 variables, our robot was doing just as well as the expert did for the journal. So this is okay. So for the forwards, we had some performance variables and some contextual variables. How about for defenders? Well, for defenders, it didn't matter at all how the player played. We could fully reproduce what the experts had provided grade-wise by looking only at the goal difference and the goals suffered and the expectation for the game. So down the line, for all practical purposes, the grade assigned for defenders was random, based on how they felt about the outcome of the game, because they were really not able to assess the many detailed steps that defenders have done. Why do I like this example? I like that because it really shows the limitations of our ability to really measure performance. That, you know, we're paying experts and we're listening to experts actually to evaluate the move-my-move play of every single player. And what we realize is that they're really blind to virtually anything that these players do in the field. Yet, they give them grades. And yet, based on those grades, some of the players will be remembered in history as great, and others will be forgotten. And this is really kind of showing the disconnect between performance and success, and that leads to my last slide. And if you want to remember something that will be really, I think, important for your success, if you can internalize this, is that performance is really truly about you, but success is about us. And if you forget this relationship, you know, I don't think that you have an easy way to enhance your success. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, László.